Welcome to another edition of the MDM podcast. I'm Mike Hockett, our executive editor. Any regular MDM reader has seen a barrage of headlines over the past 6 months that include QXO and Beacon, due to a contentious acquisition that culminated with QXO buying the roofing and other building materials distributor for $11 billion at the end of April. Quite simply, that deal and the developments that led up to it were too big to ignore. Now with the deal closed, we can dig into why QXO pursued Beacon so relentlessly and what the fallout figures to be on the building materials sector. This episode of the MDM podcast features my discussion with Craig Webb, who is founder and president of Webb Analytics, in which he serves as a consultant to lumber and building material dealers and manufacturers. Craig held editor roles at B2B publications Pro Sales and Remodeling from 2006 through 2018, at which point he launched Webb Analytics. He's also helped triangulate revenues for the building materials and construction supplies vertical on MDM's annual Top Distributors feature and has appeared on several MDM webcast events. Some of you may remember that I had Craig on the podcast about a year ago to help break down the other recent seismic acquisition back then in the form of Home Depot's $18 billion purchase of SRS Distribution. So I was happy to invite Craig back for another discussion on another mega deal in this industry sector. Craig will also join our 2025 Top Distributors webcast on June 12th to help analyze our list for building materials and construction supplies distributors. So mark your calendars for that event, which is always one of our biggest annual webcasts. With that, enjoy this episode. Craig, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
You and I did a podcast a little over a year ago after the Home Depot announced its $18 billion acquisition of SRS Distribution. That was huge for a lot of reasons. We analyzed that deal and what it meant for that now combined company and the building materials sector as a whole, and it was our most downloaded podcast of 2024. So I'm very happy to have you back here in similar fashion because for those not living under a rock, there's been another landmark building materials deal in the form of QXO completing its $11 billion acquisition of Beacon Roofing Supply at the end of April. So to dive in here, this sector of distribution has seen its fair share of big transactions over the past decade. We had Builders First Source and BMC Stock Holdings merging in 2021 to create a company that now has north of $17 billion in revenue. Foundation Building Materials was privately acquired for $1.4 billion in 2021. US LBM has been privately acquired multiple times in billion-dollar deals. But all those deals, while very large, they pale in comparison to what we saw with Home Depot SRS and now QXO Beacon. So all that said, and as someone who's covered this market for a long time, Craig, did you ever think that we'd see two deals of this magnitude, again, $18 billion and $11 billion respectively in their value, completed within 11 months of each other?
Well, no, in part because of the times that we're in, and in part because both of them arrived for different reasons. I mean, SRS was built to be sold. When they were creating it, they knew they wanted to get to a certain point, and they had gotten to the point where there really wasn't very many other people who could take them over if they did. With regard to QXO and Beacon, QXO is a very unusual company in the sense that very rarely does a billionaire walk into a room and say, "Hey, I want to control the industry." Yeah. And that happened in this case. So the fact that they happened together relatively close to each other is unusual, but the circumstances for the second one happening is even more unusual.
Yeah, Home Depot was an interesting case because it was a non-traditional player, even though they had acquired distributors over the past decade. And then, yeah, like you said, QXO comes in as this new entity and makes this giant acquisition to start its platform here in the industry. And I do want to give a quick picture of what Beacon looks like today as of the acquisition in terms of the scale of the company that QXO just bought. It's headquartered in Herndon, Virginia, and operates about 600 branches across the U.S. and Canada with about 8,000 employees. Beacon has a base of about 110,000 customers, and its 2024 revenue was $9.76 billion, which is likely going to put it at number 4 on MDM's 2025 top building materials distributors list. So, Craig, this deal was a drawn-out, contentious, back-and-forth saga that first became known this past November publicly, and one that, within a couple of months after that, started to involve both companies accusing the other of misleading statements. QXO resorted to a hostile takeover attempt so that it could go right to a Beacon shareholders vote, and there were a lot of updates along the way before both companies eventually, on March 10th, said that they were working towards a deal, and then an agreement was announced on March 19th. So, Craig, looking back at how this all played out, were you surprised to see that these two companies were able to get a deal done after all that back and forth, as Beacon had voiced for months that they were opposed to this deal, or did you figure that they would eventually find a way to get it done?
Well, one thing that you have to remember is that this was a case of a public company wanting to buy another public company. And the number of public companies in construction supply is less than the 10 fingers on my hands. Yeah. So consequently, there very well could be a large number of private hostile takeovers or private attempts to reach out to people that we just have no idea about. So this might not be all that unusual. But that said, to have a sort of a public spat like this was unusual. Now, I also think that timing figured in two different ways. One is that there's a general belief out there that the money that had been invested in QXO to go out and buy something had been sort of moldering for a while in the QXO treasury. And the investors in the company were starting to say, hey, look, we gave you this money. You need to do something with it. And previous attempts to buy something didn't work. So there could have been some pressure on Brad Jacobs to do that. The other direction is that it could possibly be that Beacon might have been able to fend this off had the economy not started to turn. And because the economy was getting a little bit worse, that purchase price, which was above the current, was above the stock price at the time, was looking better and better to the shareholders. So, the fact that there was some misleading stuff and claims back and forth, no, not a big deal. I do believe also that that Brad Jacobs, having done as many deals over the years, knew exactly in his mind what Beacon was worth, and that was what he was willing to pay for it. Consequently, when Beacon said no, he decided to take that extra step, maybe being nudged by his investors, but also out of his belief that he had set the right price.
Yeah, I think that was what was known about Brad Jacobs and his deal-making style was that he drives a very hard bargain. He is not going to overpay for a deal if the price that he has pitched is right in his mind. And Beacon, they had stuck to their only an initial offer of $124.25 per share, which valued the deal at, I think it was right around $11 billion. And that was what they stuck with for much of this back and forth process. And it wasn't until both companies announced that they had reached an agreement to when the price had gone up by 10 cents per share.
Which is sort of a face-saving gesture in my point, in my view.
And yeah, it definitely happened real late in the game here. It seemed like QXO was determined to stick to that only an initial offer, but it ended up being that purchase price they ended up paying was a 10.8x multiple of Beacon's consensus full year 2025 EBITDA and 10.1x its full year consensus 26 EBITDA. So backing up just a bit, I'm curious to get your thought on, again, how QXO is perceived to the building materials sector. And we touched on how it was this new entrant that had a billionaire founder that had led a handful of other very successful public companies. And it gave off the vibe of kind of an investment bank looking to invest in building materials. So I'm just curious for your thoughts on, as I wonder how, from the sector's perspective, how this deal played out and QXO having to go that hostile takeover route, especially from other large building materials distributors. How do they view QXO right now, or even how did they view QXO, whether it was a potential friend or a foe or just something in between? So just any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that QXO was as mysterious as its initials when it was created. It stayed mysterious for a long time because nobody had any idea where in the construction supply and building materials sector it was going to go. And I think it remains mysterious in that I think a lot of people out there don't know what it's going to do next, or how it's going to grow, where it's going to go. So consequently, it is an intriguing prospect to have Brad Jacobs give you a call, but it's also a frightful prospect because you don't know exactly where he's going or what he wants to do. Therefore, most people just tend to ignore him for now and just do their own business. The only people who are really paying attention to him now are at ABC Supply and the other roofing suppliers.
Definitely. And a little bit later, we'll get into where QXO might be targeting next. But once both of these companies announced that the deal was going to happen in March, it made me curious about, one, if QXO would rebrand Beacon, and two, if it would do so, how long that would take to happen. And both of those questions were answered right after the deal's closing, as Beacon's branding immediately was replaced with QXO's. If you go to the QXO.com webpage right now, it essentially describes QXO as Beacon was described, even stating that QXO is based in Herndon, Virginia, and it shows the same company locations, the same employee headcount that Beacon did. So were you surprised, Craig, with how fast that rebranding happened?
Well, I was a little bit, in the sense that usually you want to give people a transition to get used to you, to know, who you are or whatever. And sometimes it can take years for that rebranding to take place. In QXO's case, I think they had time to think about this. They are a public company, so they, want to get that name out there quickly. The other thing that did fascinate me, though, has to do with my LinkedIn account, where I've got thousands of people who worked at Beacon, and I was amazed at how many notices I was getting of people saying, I now work at QXO. So the employees definitely were embracing it, and that probably helped. There are other situations where a company gets taken over and they don't want to give up their old T-shirts and caps.
And yeah, further on that, the Beacon brand had been around since the company started in 1928. So we're talking a legacy name that had been around for nearly 100 years. And yeah. I don't want to speak for Beacon's current or former employees, but as you just touched on, do you see any downside with replacing a longtime brand name like that in terms of how it impacts the acquired staff, or maybe how it's perceived by its customer base? But like you said, it looks like Beacon has embraced this maybe more than we thought they would.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's special about roofing supply is that it is very much a supply business. You're not getting involved in takeoffs very much. You're not doing framing design. The extra services that you see a pro lumberyard doing are not necessarily as present in a specialty building material dealer. So I think from the point of view of the customer, once you can get them going, they're going to stick with you, and it doesn't really matter what your name is. It's Joe down at the store 2 miles down the road, more than it is Beacon or ABC Supply or SRS.
Yeah. Well, QXO has branded itself as obviously a building materials distributor especially now that it has Beacon under its wing. So it's always branded itself in what it wants to do in building materials distribution, but it's also really branded itself as a technology provider. And I think when the QXO website first launched, I think that was actually the first thing it stated was QXO is a technology company that's also targeting building materials distribution. And Brad Jacobs and the team have made it very clear about their intentions with Beacon to infuse technology into the company to upgrade its operations, equip its sales staff for them to be even more empowered. And Beacon already seemed to have some pretty sophisticated digital capabilities. They had made several recent acquisitions aimed to give it digital tools to help contractors. And they just seem to have already a robust capability there on the digital side. So, Craig, what do you make of what QXO has communicated as far as its technology plans for Beacon or just for the company in general?
Well, I really don't know what to make of what QXO is doing because there's a lot of talk that we want to do this. We believe in the power of technology. Oh, and by the way, we've hired a chief artificial intelligence officer. But beyond that, it's hard to tell exactly what they've done or what they've intended to do because I haven't seen an announcement that said we're ripping out this software or we're adding this new service.
Yeah.
I think that's all to come. And whether it is dramatically different or better than what's out there now or just, a marginal 1-yard improvement in a 100-yard game, we're going to see.
That's a great point there. Well, looking ahead, QXO has repeated that Beacon is just the first step in its plan to scale to a $50 billion building materials distributor and within the next decade. So a very aggressive outlook for them. And Beacon, with let's call it $10 billion in revenue, only gets it, 20% the way there to that $50 billion goal. And Brad Jacobs has mentioned in several interviews that QXO is in talks with several companies it's interested in acquiring. And was in talks with several companies while it was pursuing Beacon. We know it offered to buy electrical distributor Rexel earlier in 2024, but was formally rejected from that. So we don't have a crystal ball for QXO. We might not know specifically which company it's going after next. But I guess without getting too further into speculation, what are your thoughts on which building materials markets QXO is likely to target, of which we know electrical might be one of them?
Well, you're going to know a lot better than I do whether it'll get more involved in HVAC or electrical or plumbing or the like. On the construction supply side, sort of one of the most logical candidates would be somebody like USLBM, because I don't think 84 Lumber is going to be sold, and I don't think that they're going to try a public takeover of Builders First Source. So you might see a company like that. But the fact that QXO even bought Beacon surprised me because I had thought that they would probably go more into the multifamily commercial world than starting with a company that is so heavily residential as Beacon is. Residential is much more complicated, I think, than multifamily and commercial. Yeah. So my guess is that they might go a little bit more onto that latter commercial side.
Yeah, we even put out some research. I can't remember if it was early 2025 or late 2024, but kind of recapping what QXO had shared in other analyst reports or what other analysts had reported on was that QXO, when they look at what they say building materials, they don't necessarily mean specifically the structural components, or at least it's not limited to that when it comes to building materials. They're also identifying it as really any product that goes into the building and construction of a commercial or residential facility. So they, by their definition, they also include, like we said, electrical. It could be HVAC. It could be plumbing. It sounds like they're not going to touch landscaping so much, but some of these other tangential product categories, like we just said, that opens up the possibilities to a lot more companies than I think what we would traditionally consider a building materials distributor. So it is a bit of a guessing game on who they might be targeting, but certainly those kind of companies that are on our building materials distributors list, those you would assume would be the natural top candidates here. But again, I do think that it does also open up into those adjacent markets of electrical, plumbing, HVAC. There's a lot of options, I think, for QXO to go after here. As they kind of like Home Depot, I think they're trying to create that one-stop shop for contractors, for anyone that's building a residential or commercial facility. If they need plumbing that's going to go into that, I think it makes sense for QXO to find a plumbing distributor that can give them that that all-in-one kind of capacity here in the way that Home Depot is trying to create that, what do they call it, cross-functional or cross-selling opportunity there. So I think it just makes sense for that to be QXO's playbook here.
Well, that turns them into another Home Depot practically.
In a way, yeah. Well, since QXO and Beacon announced again in March that they had agreed to a deal, I do think that QXO has been doing and saying the right things as far as Brad Jacobs promoting on how he's spent these first few weeks post-closure on a listening tour, essentially holding town halls at different Beacon locations to ask and learn from employees about, one, what could be improved, and two, what would QXO be crazy to change. From my outside observation, I do think that that is an important and powerful message to get out to the public and to Beacon staff, that they are there as a listener to find out what can work and what QXO can do to help. Because there's always a lot of questions involved with any deal of this magnitude. And I think QXO may have felt some urgency to earn some goodwill, not just from Beacon staff, but from analysts and especially shareholders who saw this contentious spat play out. And there's always that negative connotation that I think comes with a hostile takeover. I'm sure that they didn't want to be seen as a bully to anyone interested in following this company. So Craig, any thoughts from you on the messaging QXO has provided since both sides agreed to the deal and this listening tour that Brad has been on since?
Well, I think QXO has proven over the past year and a half that they're very good at messaging. They're very good at getting their story out. I have heard one complaint about the firing of some of the senior executives, including one who runs the waterproofing division, that was regretted because they thought that he was a pretty good guy. If I'm a leader, of course I'm going to go out and say I want to talk to, the workers, the people out in the field. Theoretically, he already should have been doing that, but it still sounds good to do that. I think that as far as the employees are concerned, it wasn't that they necessarily hated the current managers or that they thought that those guys were incompetent, because Beacon had been growing substantially under the leadership that just left. But at the same time, once it became inevitable that there was going to be a new owner, I think that the people who were working for Beacon were going to say, well, let's try to make the best out of this and keep going.
Indeed. Well, since that acquisition is now final and Beacon's branding has been fully replaced with QXO's, that does mean that QXO will likewise take Beacon's place on MDM's 2025 top distributors list for building materials, and that feature is set to publish in the first half of June, which will include our top distributors webcast on June 12th, which I highly recommend our listeners tune in for. And Craig, like you did last year, you'll be joining that webcast to help break down our list for the top building materials and construction supplies distributors. So definitely looking forward to having you back in front of the MDM audience then. With that, Craig, certainly thank you for joining this MDM podcast again. And my guess is that this period of big deals and building materials distribution isn't going to end anytime soon. So it's great to have you on here to analyze what's been happening. Before we sign off here, any parting words or thoughts on QXO Beacon?
Well, I think QXO Beacon is just, another landmark on the general trend that we're seeing of people trying to produce bigger, better, more complicated, but also more comprehensive companies. Not long after QXO, we did have another $1 billion deal when Lowe's bought Artisan Design Group and said they wanted to get more pros. And just before the QXO deal, Foundation Building Materials purchased another company. So things are happening all the time, and I think that gives people more and more reason to keep touch and keep watching what you're doing, Mike, because you're providing new news all the time.
Yeah, I will not complain about the web traffic it's produced, but it has kept us and yourself very busy on the writing side here. And like we already touched on, we know that QXO is not going to just go quiet at this point. That they have big plans for the next 5 to 10 years here. So I'm sure we'll see plenty more out of them.
Well, the great thing for people like you and me is that because they're a public company, they have to tell other people about what they're doing.
That's true.
So
Yeah.
that makes it possible for us to have some insights into the company that we might not have at other times.
Yeah. Well, Craig, that's all I got. Anything else before we close out?
No, thank you for the opportunity to spend time with you, and let's keep talking because the news is going to keep happening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the MDM podcast. Like what you just heard? You can find all of our past episodes at mdm.com/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, mark your calendars for MDM's upcoming Virtual Data Analytics Summit to be held on June 18th. The half-day event is designed for distribution professionals eager to explore the latest trends in analytics and data-driven decision-making. It's free, and you can register and view the agenda from the events drop-down on our website.